So we've all seen pictures that are in black and white but have a little bit of color still added back in. Let's take a look at a couple examples real quick. So these are pretty ubiquitous images. We see them all over the place. The entire thing's in black and white, but somehow we have a little bit of color that's been added back into the picture. So today I'm going to show you how to do that with the history brush. So by the end of our little lesson, we're going to go from this to this. Now, there are a couple of ways to do this, and you don't actually need to use the history brush. You could also get the same effect using the eraser or just flat out deleting something, but I thought this would be a good idea to just learn using the history brush. So let's say we opened up an image in Photoshop. The first thing we'll notice is we have a background, so we're just going to double click that. I'm going to name it pencils. We really need that to become a layer and not the background. So the first thing we want to do is really duplicate this layer. So I'll hit Command J, that'll make a copy, and I'm just going to label this pencils black and white. I always like to have my layers labeled, even if it's something simple like this. So now we need to take this colored layer and turn it into black and white. I'll go to Image, Adjustments, and down to black and white. Now for the time being, I don't really care about any of this stuff. I just care that my pencils are now in black and white. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. We could always adjust those levels. You could go into Image and Adjustments. You could use the brightness and contrast if you want to change that as well. But again, that's sort of off topic. Now we want to go down and find the history brush. It's right underneath the clone stamp. It is a brush that has a little dashed arrow pointing behind it. The keyboard shortcut is Y. Before we do anything, let's just talk about brushes a little bit. This goes for the paintbrush, the eraser, basically anything that uses a brush in Photoshop. So this tells me that I'm using the history brush. Again, if I change that to the regular paintbrush, that would show up. So history brush, first thing I want to do is select the type of brush I'm going to use. So I prefer a feathered brush. We can look at a hard brush if we want. I will set my flow back to 100, so this would be like the default hard brush. And I could just click, and we'll notice really quickly that, hey, it's adding that color back. So if we notice though, look at how sloppy it is. Now that's because of two things. One, I have a hard brush. So when I click or drag, it's going to be the full stroke of the brush all the time. So even if I just click somewhere over here perhaps, there we go. I have the full circle of the brush. Now let's choose a feathered brush and see what happens. So I'll click in that exact same spot. Now with a feathered brush, we notice that the center is colored and then it naturally uses a gradient to feather out to transparent. So it's a lot softer. I think it looks a lot more natural, so I prefer to use a feathered brush. Now the other thing that we have, this is a little trick up our sleeve, is flow. So flow at 100% will do just that. When I click, it's now brushed 100%. So in our case, it's using the history brush 100%. Well, I can drop that down to, let's say, 10%. Then when I click, it's only going to be showing or using 10% of the brush. So I think that using the combination of some feathered brush plus the flow down to less than 20% works really well when we're trying to do these fine detailed things. So let me undo a few steps. I'll go back and now we're right where we're started. So let's talk about what the history brush actually does. In this file, my first history state are the colored pencils because that's the only thing that's in the file. Then I duplicated it and now I have a black and white layer on top of it. After I duplicated it, I hit turn to black and white. So that was 2 steps. But my original state are the colored pencils. So the history brush, all it does is when you're on a new layer or any state that's after that, it's going to revert back to the original snapshot or state that you were in. So all I'm doing is I'm just telling it to go back to the very first state that it was in, which is color. So if ultimately I'm trying to get just the pencil tips colored, again, this is our exact same file, So I started with colored pencils. I want just the tips. I can do a couple of things. One, I could just click and use the brush. Notice how it's fading in. That's because my flow is at 10%. I also have that nice feathered brush, so that's helping out as well. If I zoom in, this looks pretty accurate. So if I started on this pencil and I used this brush, we would notice that I'm starting to show some color outside of the tip. So that's when we can start to combine the tools that we use. So I like to be very careful. I would use the Polygonal Lasso. If you don't see it, that's because it's hiding under the normal lasso. And I would actually select very carefully the area that you want to color in. That way, we don't accidentally go outside of the lines. So we're sort of creating our own little stencil for ourselves. Now up top, I don't have to be very accurate. In fact, I can be quite lazy. Because I have that flow down, it's going to sort of naturally just fade back to the black and white. So I'll go back and forth up top, reintroduce all that color, then maybe I'll only do 1 or 2 strokes towards the bottom. That way the color naturally blends in with the black and white part. Then I can hit Command D to deselect, and that pencil tip looks great. If I need to touch it up, I'll just hit Y. I'll go back in again, make sure that the very tip of the pencil has the most color, and again that I've faded to the black and white. Then what I would do is I would just zoom in, use my lasso, the Polygonal Lasso that is, select very carefully, and just do the same thing over and over again until I have all of the tips, or really any part of the image that I want to reintroduce that color to. So I can hit Y, or I can go right below the clone stamp. And I'm just going to do this until I'm satisfied with the amount of color that I have reintroduced. So again, if you want to be really careful and make it look very believable and very accurate, I would go ahead and use that Polygonal Lasso to actually select the area that you want to reintroduce color to. That way it looks nice and believable. That's it.